Hello everybody, welcome to my series on key concepts and ideas in social and philosophical history. This series will explore watershed thoughts in Western theory that change the way we understand the world around us forever. And few thinkers have had such an impact as the 20th century theorist Michel Foucault, whose concept of the Panopticon will be the topic of this video. To begin, let's briefly outline Foucault's life, some influences that surround him, and core ideas that define his career, as this will give greater context to understanding the idea of the Panopticon. Born in Poitiers, France, in 1926, Foucault studied under Jean Hippolyte and Louis Althusser at the University of Paris Sorbonne, where he trained in psychology and philosophy. While Hippolyte was very strong in his influence of German Romantic philosophy, notably Hegel, it was, from my perspective at least, Althusser who had the most lasting impact on Foucault's thought. A Marxist philosopher, Althusser posited ideas such as interpellation, which is whereby identity and ideology become uncomfortably interlinked, and individuals become ingrained within the ideology of the state. This has large consequences on all aspects of life, whereby individuals become subjects, caught up in vast web of connections that make a person become subjective to far greater forces than themselves. To illuminate this, Althusser takes the common handshake as an example, a moment when the individual becomes tied to a far wider social construct that in turn will change and motivate an individual's behavior. What Althusser is questioning here is how an ideology can become so deeply ingrained within a society. This is whereby people lose their sense of complete freedom as individuals, who has no fundamental obligation by nature to much at all, into believing a whole series of rigid social hierarchies, customs and beliefs that would see them perhaps even willingly give away their own lives to defend. For Althusser, this occurs on the basic, tiny, everyday rituals, whereby we are continually impelled into something greater than ourselves. And this occurs through things like the morning chat at the water cooler, or the common handshake, for instance. This is important to remember, as Foucault's career revolves around the analysis of the individual and its relation to greater social forces, and this is especially in trying to examine points of freedom that we may or may not possess in our current society. So, for instance, in the 1961 study, The History of Madness, Foucault examines the origin of the field of psychiatry, showing when madness became a field of treatable specialization, and this meant that psychological norms were being developed. Similarly, in the 1976 work The History of Sexuality, sees Foucault illuminate the shift of sexual norms in society, pinpointing moments in history whereby so-called sexual deviancy became a matter of the state, rather than a local village or community affair to decide. This has far-reaching normalizing consequences. For instance, let's take a look at something that has been a very contentious issue in post-industrial society, that of homosexuality, which has been treated often as a clinical psychological disorder. In the United Kingdom, for instance, it was only in 1885 when homosexuality was no longer even a capital offence. But even then it was still highly frowned upon by the law, with cases such as Oscar Wilde, the playwright, receiving 2 years hard labour, or, most horrifically in my opinion, the great World War II codebreaker Alan Turing being chemically castrated, only to take his life shortly after. This law was not repealed until 1967, and even then homosexuality was just decriminalised, but was still regarded as illegal. So with all this in mind, what is the Panopticon, and what is its relevance to our current world for Foucault? Well, all the examples that I've previously mentioned examine the movement from a pre- to post-industrialized society, from serf-based communities to capital-driven populations. And this movement arose from a need to reform all aspects of life in order to create coherence between capitalist ideology and outcomes in society. It is here that we can really see the influence of Althusser on Foucault's thought, whereby Foucault is very interested in how the state in post-industrialized countries continually becomes more and more invested in the everyday life of its citizens, attempting to normalise their behaviours, down all the way to their sexuality even. So without further ado, here is the Panopticon. These are sketches of the concept, and certain real-world examples contained in Discipline and Punishment by Foucault. What we are confronted with is a prison, though it is certainly not necessarily a prison. It is a tower surrounded by cells, very much all what we would consider a prison to be. The tower is in such a position that the occupants of the cells may never tell who or what is in the guard tower. Think here of an airport control tower that stands ominously above everyone. No one may see inside the tower, and they may not know who, if anyone, is looking at what or when. Conceived by the English political theorist Jeremy Bentham, it is a concept that would be idealized to optimizing society. This method was already in use to some degree in military barracks, hospitals, prisons and schools. But in order to understand the extent of this idea, Foucault sees in the Panopticon all the current technologies of discipline condensed into their idealized form. So let's dig a little deeper and understand why or what the Panopticon would do. Well, in all the examples that I've previously mentioned, Foucault is concerned with a world that is changing from a pre- to post-industrialized society. In other words, society was moving from a feudal, serf-based system into a capital-driven, bourgeois society. So in this way, I am not advocating for some type of conspiracy of control, rather the manifestation of new realities due to events that were unforeseen by human beings. In this way, Foucault sees that the Panopticon came out of a reality of an unforeseen event caused by the movement of a pre- to post-industrial society. This event was the Black Plague, whereby there was a specific need to quarantine and document precisely areas of infection. What this created was the capillary functioning of power, whereby power is acutely affected on targeted areas in which the very living spaces of individuals became catalogued and open for inspection. In other words, the very living bodies and spaces of people became the very site of political power and inspection. This thought is a little bit counterintuitive, however, to our modern thinking, whereby we often conceive of structures of power being driven by the state or some mysterious Illuminati. For Foucault, however, changing power structures are closely related to greater shifts in social structures, and the need to realign power to the new fundamental ideologies that certain societies find themselves in this case, bourgeois capitalism. So in the case of the Panopticon, finding its origins in the Black Plague, and having an already highly developed system in use in the Catholic Church confession, the Panopticon is an invention of discipline in the world of subjects and yet populations. So how is it possible to discipline people into conforming with capitalistic ideas, yet whereby the largeness of these populations mean that individual disciplining is too difficult to achieve? So while this is all well and good in a theoretical sense, how does it actually translate into the real world? Well, to illuminate this point to begin with, I'm going to create a hypothetical situation in which we can understand the Panopticon. The example I'm going to use is of a child, and this child is a metaphor for the movement of serfdom into the modern age of society. So this child has no real opinions or ambitions in the world, but its parents want it to become the greatest pianist that ever lived. The child takes lessons, performs at school and social events, and this is really all a public display of skill. All is well and good. But what would be the most efficient way of creating technique within the child's pianistic skills? Well, let's say that the child has a piano in a large room, almost like an auditorium. There is a ceiling with 2 floors. Now let's say that on the second floor there is a darkened window, one that the child cannot see into. One day the child is bored and wants to simply jingle around instead of practicing scales. It does so. Nothing happens. The child jingles away, breaking from the routine, before after a while returning to its practice schedule. No one seems to be the wiser. The next day, the child is playing scales with a metronome. Bored once again, the child invents a game to practice the scales with so time can pass quicker. Suddenly, the light goes on in the room overlooking the practice area, where a darkened silhouette stands. The child freezes. A cold sweat comes over them, and they go back to practicing scales, pretending nothing has happened. The room goes dark once more, and there is no mention of the incident ever. So, when we consider this quite extreme scenario, we are met with a version of the panoptic disciplining technique. The child is being disciplined, but instead of forceful disciplining, standing over and smacking fingers, the discipline comes from the most ingenious way, from the child itself. Now this might seem like a complete fallacy, and on one level, it is. Clearly the child is frightened of a reprisal from its parents. However, on a secondary level, and this is crucial to understanding Foucault, the child can no longer tell when or when not it is being observed. It becomes, in Foucault's words, once caught in a state of conscious and permanent visibility that assures automatic functioning of power to itself. What this means is that, once laid bare before its eyes that it cannot see, the child becomes caught up in a power situation in which they are the bearers. In other words, the child becomes conscious of their own actions and subjectivity. At first the child is caught doing something wrong, and under the gaze becomes aware of its own wrongdoing. Now aware that at all times it may or may not be being observed, the child becomes more conscious of its own behaviour and begins correcting itself automatically. The child, if all goes theoretically to plan, will almost procedurally and mechanically turn itself into one of the greatest pianists that has ever existed. So if we zoom out of this very specific scenario and relate this to broader social circumstances, we begin to find the true meaning of the Panopticon for Foucault. Firstly, let's think about greater methods of surveillance. Not just the institutional, such as during high school exams or the hospital ward, or even in totalitarian states, where one is always suspicious of the milkman, the elderly lady down the street, or even a member of one's own family. But let's consider our own society. Even Foucault himself could not have envisioned the world that is saturated with the surveillance camera. Often these are only monitored for things such as vehicle accidents or criminal activity in hindsight, but the very essence of something watching our every move, in which we may never tell if we are being watched or not, alters our behaviour and the way we consider society around us. In other words, just like the child and the piano, we become self-disciplining creatures. Secondly, if we consider Althusser's concept of interpellation again, what does this kind of constant surveillance impel us towards? When my very self is under constant inspection, what are the behaviours that I have subconsciously adopted? These self-disciplining behaviours are so normalised now that it is almost impossible for me to even consider. Not only that, but I have internalised so much what normal behaviour is. And this completely autonomous interpolation of my reality is really only found out in uncomfortable moments when I witness those that are unable to be pulled within the binds of self-disciplining systems. So when we consider Foucault's research into mental illness or sexuality, we can understand the shift from problems being dealt with in a very different manner, or not even being seen as problems at all, in the past. It is only now when I am confronted by the actuality of very different behaviours that I begin to understand for even just a brief moment how normalised most behaviour, including my own, actually is. And then we have so many services and institutions of correctional behaviour that any abnormal behaviours are swiftly moved from our sight, whereby a person's behaviour is corrected until it's once deemed again healthy to be moved back into society as large. Hopefully, above all else, with the skill of self-disciplining. In essence, the people, or even in extreme circumstances, nature, such as shark paranoia, is whereby self-disciplining behaviours no longer work, and they become an absolute burden to our society and its ideological causes. This is why there is so much negative language around people and things in our society that aren't self-disciplining, and they are often talked about in negative or stigmatic fashion. Now there is nothing wrong per se with all of this, especially if we are not the ones who are marginalised by the panoptic system. What is perhaps Foucault's greatest problem is that the tighter this self-disciplining system binds itself, the more we become subjected to personalised scrutiny, the more we discipline more aspects of our lives, and then the more we judge any kind of difference. This has two important aspects to it. On the one hand, this limits our ability to express ourselves. On the other hand, however, we become completely embroiled in the production of capital and the ideologies of capitalism. This means that not only may we deny other versions of reality in which society may be far happier, but through this self-disciplining, we ourselves, in every moment, thought and action, are actually custodians and champions of a post-industrial, capital-driven world. As with the child pianist that self-perpetuates its own discipline to become the pianist that it never wished to be, so too are we the soldiers for an ideology of which we never really chose. For Foucault, this is the greatest danger, as the world it creates becomes more rigid, hard, and ultimately brutal towards any malfunctions within its order. This is a terrifying thought, as following Foucault's thought about the Panopticon, it is a regime not enforced from the outside, such as in Nazism or totalitarian states, but actually perpetuated from within. So it is on these thoughts that I will leave you with. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video.